All right, IDF spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner joins me now from Israel. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
Thank you. We're doing good.
Can you explain to me why the focus on Han Yunis now? Is that because the leaders were born there, Mohammed Dif and Yahya Sinwar, and by killing them, and I know there's a lot of intelligence effort being focused on that now by Israel. By killing them, what can you achieve?
So the focus of our operation since day one has been on centers of gravity of Hamas's governing capabilities and instruments. So of course, after dealing with Gaza City, after engaging in Jabalia, after increasing our activities in the last few days in Shujaiya, where there are substantial battalions, so substantial forces, it makes sense to develop that operation also into other areas, and Khan Yunis and the area of Khan Yunis and areas in the surroundings of Khan Yunis have definite, I would say, elements of that system, of that enterprise that Hamas has developed. And of course, for those leaders like Dif or Sinwar, that is their, I would say, natural habitat to begin with. So there's definitely reason to believe that there's a reason to operate in those areas beyond the individual needs. So these leaders, if we've identified them as the mastermind, and Sinwar is the mastermind of the 7th of October attack, and he's the person that financed it and gave the green light to go, and Dif is the partner that his partner in crime to devise the plan, then it makes sense to hunt them down and seek them out wherever they are.
And if you're successful, and I assume, long term, you have a pretty good chance of eventually eliminating them, what does that say to the rest of their followers, and what do you achieve by doing that?
So the way Hamas has developed over the last 16 years from a terrorist organization to a terrorist government requires a significant, I would say, substantial paradigm change. With the powers of government, they created a terrorist army that came into Israel on the 7th of October. With the powers of government, they were able to create a terrorist industry that develops, and launches huge rocket attacks against Israel, even to today. With the powers of government, they created what they called their naval forces or air forces, which is drone capabilities, naval commando unit capabilities. So that is why taking out the leadership, the planners, and the operatives is key to eliminating Hamas from the governing capabilities of Gaza. If we deal with all three levels of those, it will create a better security situation for Israel. It will create an improved security situation for the Palestinians of Gaza that have been living under this regime. So from our perspective, the end state needs to create that improved security situation for everyone.
No pressure, no time pressure, right?
So the government
I asked that facetiously because, under the international community, the pressure is huge on Israel, whether it's coming from the Americans. Then you have people like French President Macron, who has said that the destruction of Hamas is at cross purposes with protecting civilians. Quote, the total destruction of Hamas, question mark. Does anybody think that's possible? If it's that, the war will last 10 years. What would be your response to that?
So obviously, I don't communicate with presidents and prime ministers. But I do agree that there are ways to fight this war. And I also see that the vast global leadership are supportive with the idea that Hamas has to go. There is no fairy godmother that can wish away Hamas and hope that they just disappear. That can only be done through military force. That military force is being utilized in accordance to the laws of armed conflict in, I would say, an unprecedented battleground. Even the battles conducted in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria against different similar jihadi type enemies did not take place in the densely type locations that we have in the Gaza Strip. So of course there's a huge challenge to that. But if we want to achieve our goal in making sure that Hamas never have that power of destruction and death against Israel again, there are no other opportunities, no real options than use of military force. We do acknowledge and do realize that the humanitarian effort goes hand in hand with the operational effort. We do realize and operate in accordance to the laws of armed conflict, which means we are distinguishing between terrorists and civilians. We devised a whole evacuation plan to get people out of harm's way, specifically because we operate within the laws of armed conflict. There is no indiscriminate
how do you do it?
fire.
I mean, can you take me there? Because it's one thing to say that, but how do you actually do it? I've been in Han Yunis, Gaza City, those dense streets, potentially some of the walls, like they did in the West Bank and Jenin, can be booby-trapped. There are people, popping up out of tunnels, firing RPGs. How do you mitigate civilian casualties? I understand you're trying to move civilians out of there, but how do you mitigate that? And how, under all of these calls for the IDF to be more humanitarian, to pay more attention to the numbers of civilian casualties, how do you protect your own troops on the ground?
So there is a balance, obviously, and primarily we need to identify and acknowledge that it was Hamas that chose and continue to choose the battleground, where to fight. They don't come out and fight against us. They hide beneath hospitals, they hide beneath schools, they hide in the kindergartens and mosques. They hide in and around UN facilities. They've built this massive hundreds of kilometers. They say 500 kilometers of tunnels beneath Gaza. The Gaza Strip is 365 square kilometers. So that just goes how they perceive their own force in this capability. So once they've chosen this battleground and we're left to fight against them, we have to operate in an extensive evacuation plan from the specific locations we intend to conduct our battle.
Are you taking more losses? Are you endangering more of your own soldiers now, trying to fight a war that, I mean, you could do with artillery, you can do with tank fire, but understanding civilian casualties, caught in the crossfire, you're obviously trying to mitigate that, but you risk your own soldiers' lives at the same time. You lost, what, 7 yesterday, I think, on one given day.
We have, I think, almost 80 soldiers and officers that have been lost since the ground offensives commenced.
In Gaza.
The reality, of course, is one where we are operating in the progress and the advance of the forces is very, I would say, strategic, but also systematic in a way that maximizes force protection. It is all conducted under the cover of aerial support. It is all conducted with the assistance of engineering units in order to dismantle explosive devices, the tunnel network. We found just in the north of the Gaza Strip so far more than 800 tunnels and access points to tunnels. We've destroyed and dismantled 500 of those. But everywhere we go, we're finding more and more, because that is precisely the modus operandi of Hamas. So we are maximizing force protection on one hand, but also operating under the understanding that we are operating in an urban area. That means we need to safeguard and minimize the civilian casualties by evacuation, by temporary evacuation, for telling specific neighborhoods in specific areas, in specific towns, to evacuate, where to evacuate to, but more importantly, where to evacuate from. Yes, there is a challenge in that. It is a challenge faced, I would say, by most professional militaries today. And I would also say that we are learning from our American colleagues how they conducted their battles and wars in the region, in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Syria. And I would say we're improving on those precisely because we are trying to minimize the civilian casualties, but maintain and indeed achieve our military goals of dismantling Hamas, destroying their operational and terrorist capabilities and their governing capabilities, but also bringing back the hostages.
Can I ask you, the State Department says one of the reasons that Hamas won't turn over women hostages is because of the very fact that they may have done to them what they have done in other areas where they, like the music concert, like some of the kibbutzim, that they systematically abused women, they systematically raped women, even though the UN and other international organizations were slow to speak out on that, and some still haven't. That may be one of the very reasons that Hamas is slow to turn over those hostages. Can you just quickly address that?
The issue of hostages is a national priority, and of course a priority for the IDF. I can't really elaborate on the reasoning or why Hamas is not handing it over.
The international community, human rights, so-called human rights groups, were very slow to acknowledge the human rights crimes against Israeli women when Hamas left the Gaza Strip and attacked southern Israel, and is an extension of possibly the holding of female hostages in Gaza because of the very reason that some of those women have been abused and raped and worse.
So there are two questions here. First of all, the treatment of hostages. I would say, first of all, we're demanding that the international humanitarian organizations, and specifically the International Committee of the Red Cross, have access to the hostages in order to assess their well-being. So the well-being is a top priority. And the second is how the international community have responded to this brutal massacre against Israel, against Israeli society, Israelis on the border, whether it's men, women, children, elderly, and that has absolutely been very slow. And there are questions that need to be asked on that, but that's definitely not the military's responsibility to address that issue.
If I can ask you one more thing, and that is that, and you retweeted it, so it goes a little outside of what you're doing on the ground in Gaza and your role as the IDF spokesman, but many people will say that Israel is responsible for elevated terrorist threats in Europe now, in Canada and America because of the war in Gaza. Yesterday, you had this very dramatic exchange with Congresswoman Stefanik against what she's questioning Harvard and other university professors about whether calling for the genocide of Jews violates their codes of conduct on bullying and harassment. And the president's essentially declined to label such calls as bullying and harassment, stating it depends on the context and whether it translates into actionable behavior. So does not the language of annihilation, whether you want to comment on that directly or not, does not the language of annihilation of Jews not feed the threat levels? And it is something that whether it's there, whether it's here, responsible people have to step forward and stop that violent language that includes everything from annihilating Jews, pushing them into the sea, and much more than that.
I probably overstepped on my retweet this morning on that subject. There is a very, very serious concern about what is happening. To connect the rise of violence or anti-Semitism against Jews to the actions of Israel is in itself an anti-Semitic action. So of course, as a Jew, I feel connected to the family of Jews around the world, and that is why it is, of course, extremely concerning. We have to do better, I think, in the world of identifying, differentiating. We have to do better at accepting that Israel has responsibility to the people of Israel, but also have responsibility to the Jewish people around the world. And I think we try and weigh out those two very important goals together. Israel needs to be able to live in safety and security. The Jewish people around the world need to be able to live in safety and security as well.
And condemning violent language against Jews, obviously, is an important thing for political leaders. You don't have to say it. I'll say it, and people should be more willing to step out and speak out against it. And I really do appreciate you even attempting to address that question. I know some of it's political. So Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, Peter, thank you so much for your time and explaining what's going on and as best you can. And I really do appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Dana.